Summer 2010 was a big one for me. It was my first summer out of high school, for starters, but more importantly, it was the summer I found my favorite film of all time. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World combined the bold, hilarious, magical gamer realism of Brian Lee O'Malley's tankobon format black and white indie comic with the even bolder and more inventive cinematic vision of the greatest living director, Edgar Wright. Plus, basically all of the funniest young actors in Hollywood at the time, who would later go on to mostly be megastars, and a lot of the best bands I'd ever heard in my life up to that point. I'm not normally the sort to rewatch movies. I generally prefer experiencing new stories to rehashing old ones, but somehow I got around to watching Scott Pilgrim 7 times in the summer of 2010 alone. It's been several dozen in the years since. Despite my best efforts, the film was a complete box office bob-omb, but the critics loved it as much as I did, as did many other fans of the original manga-adjacent thing. And over the years, the film's cult following grew to the point we got an anniversary re-release in 2021, plus a gorgeous new collector's edition for the Xbox Live Arcade beat-em-up. And even crazier, in 2020 now, a full-blown Scott Pilgrim Netflix original anime. Which is anime, like, unquestionably, by any workable definition, but I made a whole video on the main channel about that. In this video, I just want to gush about one of my new top contenders for Anime of the Year, because it's been out a couple days at this point, and I've already watched it twice. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off takes most of the incredible talents who made that incredible movie and mashes them together with the incredible anime studio that gave us Japan Sinks 2020, Tatami Galaxy, Heike Monogatari, Devilman Crybaby, and the greatest sports anime of all time, Ping Pong the Animation. Also, Anamanaguchi, the god-tier chiptune band that scored the official indie Scott Pilgrim beat-em-up I was just talking about, came back to write an OST that complements the film's god-tier licensed music, making this anime unquestionably the ultimate mixed media expression of the whole Scott Pilgrim brand.
Didn't you read my letter?
Kind of.
I hand-delivered it during a blizzard.
Remind me what it said exactly?
And if you're simply here wondering whether the resulting anime is worth your time to watch, either as a longtime fan or a newcomer, my answer is an unequivocal yes. Speaking as someone who loves and grew up with these characters, I love everything this show does to expand on and refine them, and every last fight scene in the series is an absolute dream come true. Aside from a couple hype moments in Frieren, this is the only fight-centric anime this year that comes anywhere near Jujutsu Kaisen's weight class. The way its action blends anime and video game logic with endless clever little references and creative experimental visuals feels distinctly reminiscent of the anarchic animated action of Fooly Cooly. And it does so without ever trying to be Fooly Cooly, which is, of course, the only way to actually be Fooly Cooly. That's where all the Fooly Cooly sequels went wrong. Though, stylistically, the blend of anime-style cinematicism with more abstract, cartoony visuals in Scott Pilgrim feels a bit more akin to Panty and Stocking or Space Patrol Luluco. Also, much like Cyberpunk Edgerunners, this is an all-around peak Anime of the Year contender without a single second of wasted screen time. So, whether you liked Sex Bomb before they were cool, or you're an uninitiated anime fan who's just feeling a little Scott curious, I'd say this show is absolutely worth the time it takes to watch. Preferably blind, if that's still possible for you at this point, though I would also recommend checking out the original movie either before or immediately after you binge the anime so you can fully appreciate the many extremely clever differences between the adaptations.
Hey, you know Pac-Man?
I know of him.
You know Sonic the Hedgehog?
However, with all that said, that's nowhere near all I have to say about this anime, because those aren't the only high-profile ex-Gainax productions I could be comparing Scott Pilgrim to. And even telling you what that comparison is risks spoiling one of the coolest things about this anime for old and new fans alike. So, if you want to take me up on that whole watch it blind suggestion, now's the time to pause this video and get binging. If you're still here at the end of this sentence, you are going to start hearing spoilers. Sorry, they are simply unavoidable in discussing what makes this anime top tier. Because Scott Pilgrim Takes Off isn't just a chance to see Ramona and Scott's fighting skills and the various powers of their various exes adapted into glorious science Saru Sakuga. It's a full-blown Evangelion-style reboot of the core Scott Pilgrim concept. One that turns the dynamic between Scott and Ramona on its head, making him the object of the story and her the subject, letting us see new, less evil sides of their exes and some very fun fight matchups that never would have been possible in the original timeline. The series sets all this up with brilliant subtlety too, playing the first episode mostly straight as a truncated retelling of Scott and Ramona's meet-cute, the skimming of Matthew Patel's letter, and Scott's failure to break up with his fake high school girlfriend immediately before Patel crashes their show with Crash and the Boys.
Mr. Pilgrim!
The episode makes plenty of changes compared to both the film and comics, some subtle, a lot not, but the sum total of those changes feels mostly like an organic effort to just cut inessential content for time, get to the point, and possibly cut back a little bit of the creep factor of Scott's relationship with Knives by scaling it back to, they held hands once and she comes to see all his shows. Not that Scott being a bit of a creep is bad for the original story, it's very important to his arc, but it's also a problematic sticking point for a lot of people who don't want to get into the comics or movie, so I can see why they change it to soften that a little. And thankfully, it doesn't stop the show from interrogating the deep flaws in Scott's character. In fact, I think the new angle they approach that from might be even stronger than the original, but now I'm getting way ahead of myself. And besides, these aren't just minor changes designed to make the adaptation more palatable for modern audiences and, fit the runtime. They're set up for the big payoff of the Patel fight, in which the Bollywood-flavored Broadway wannabe unleashes his mystical powers on our hero, and Scott vanishes in a poof of coins. Episode 1, the evil exes have won. Our hero is dead, and the whole story becomes something new entirely. A murder mystery, or a kidnapping into fake murder mystery, to be more accurate, as we learn at the end of episode 2, after Matthew Patel's carried that momentum into a violent takeover of the League of Evil Exes and Gideon's billion-dollar entertainment empire, and Envy Adams has crashed Scott's funeral with a guerrilla concert to make it all about her, which is just the most perfect way imaginable to introduce her character, honestly. And I really like how she's introduced in the comic and the movie. That's so good. What an amazing way to show rather than tell how dominating she is in Scott's life. But I digress. After all that's happened, Ramona dreams her way into Scott's subspace highway, and there she hears his voice calling out to her from the distance. Realizing that someone must have kidnapped him and faked his death, she sets out to interrogate Scott's friends, her evil exes, and anyone else who might have a motive in order to find the boy she went on one date with and find out if the thing that they had was actually, a thing. Scott Pilgrim, the original comic that is at its core a story about Scott gradually getting to know Ramona through his violent clashes with her past, as his relationship with her pushes him to understand and overcome his own shortcomings as a man. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, conversely, is all about Ramona gradually getting to know the absent Scott as she investigates his disappearance and interacts with his friends, while her quest and the experience of being left by someone special just when things were getting serious instead of doing the leaving simultaneously forces her to confront her own fear of commitment and find a form of closure with her exes that doesn't involve anyone exploding into loonies and toonies. Through this reframing, the anime is able to tell a completely different story that builds on the original in fascinating ways and takes its characters in exciting new directions. Directions that will be extremely fun for longtime fans, especially fanfickers, to discover, and more importantly, directions that set these characters up to return in the event this anime finally gets the recognition Scott Pilgrim deserves and Netflix greenlights a sequel. This alternate what if Scott never beat the X's timeline is honestly a genius excuse to not, kill off half the series' most interesting personalities right after we meet them. And I respect that a lot. But what I respect infinitely more is how this remix story still manages to deliver all the essential elements of Scott Pilgrim, so that it fully works as a standalone adaptation and introduction to the series' world and characters for folks who've never read the comic or seen the movie. And it does so with only a little bit of meta-narrative assistance from the in-universe attempt to film the original Scott Pilgrim movie with Lucas Lee as Scott, based on a script from a parallel universe, and later the Scott Pilgrim off-Broadway musical starring Matthew Patel. By the end of this series, just like the comic and the movie, you'll know everything you need to know about every evil X and everyone in Scott's life, and you'll fully understand why he and she are meant to be. Just, from Ramona's perspective, and with happier, less evil endings for most of the X's. Not all. Gideon still ends up evil in the end, despite going through a nice guy phase in the middle of everything. However, now it's for a much healthier reason. He used to be evil because he was an insecure billionaire with trust issues, but now he's evil because his evil girlfriend Julie thinks it's super duper hot. The rest, though, aren't really painted as evil at all, just misguided, emotionally damaged, and maybe manipulated a little by the demons they can summon with their mystical powers, depending on the guy. Luke Lee's pretty likable when you take away the fame and tone down the ego. The Katayanagi twins are just total bros. So's Roxy, come to think of it. Todd Ingram's surprisingly sensitive, given a bit of distance from Envy. And as for Envy, well, the movie gave her some emotional redemption. Maybe the anime will too if it gets that sequel. It would also be nice to see them work Lisa in if that happens. But by far, the X who comes away looking the best in this new version has gotta be Knives Chow. Scott cheating on her in the other versions plays absolute havoc with her emotions and absolutely decimates her confidence for a really long time. But him dying ends up having the opposite effect. Because this version of Knives has no choice but to move on, she throws herself into music to take her mind off the loss and ultimately discovers she's kind of a genius.
How long have you been playing bass?
What time is it?
4 p.m.?
Oh, then 4 hours.
Between all this character growth and the incredible way her comic design has translated to animation, plus the fact that Ellen Wong is like a really good voice actress compared to most of the Hollywood cast, I think this might be my favorite version of Knives. And that's nuts, because she was already one of my favorite characters. But the really crazy part is that watching this new interpretation of Knives also made me appreciate both previous versions of her more, because every one of these alternate takes on the characters is written in a way consistent with their other portrayals, with the differences coming from how they react in character to changes in the scenario, rather than just being arbitrary differences for the sake of doing something different. So watching this version of the story doesn't just give us new alternate forms of closure for each of their arcs, it enhances our understanding of every version of every character by showing us how they'd react to different things. Like, now that we know Todd is in the closet, that totally changes everything about how he interacts with Envy in the movie and the comics. And the way that Luke and Gordon are just instant best friends when they lose their fame and money respectively is just... I'm obsessed with it. I love that whole bit so much. Watching Scott Pilgrim Takes Off will deepen your appreciation for the movie and the comic in exactly the same way that knowing how the story's supposed to go enhances your appreciation of the anime. It's a remarkable writing magic trick, and my hat goes off to Brian Lee O'Malley and Ben David Grabinski for making it work. Funny enough, despite his relative lack of screen time, Scott might be the one who benefits most from this dynamic, aside from Ramona. Eventually, it's revealed that none of the evil exes were behind his disappearance. The Katayanagi twins did help by unlocking the secrets of time travel, but ultimately, it was Scott himself who set these alternate events in motion. Specifically, old Scott. That is, the one from the original comic, but also a Scott from the future, who kidnaps his past self to stop him from ever dating Ramona to save himself the future pain of divorce. Or, to be more accurate, the pain of not understanding the difference between a divorce and a temporary separation for the long-term health of the relationship, because Scott's kind of stupid like that. And while he did go through a lot to win Ramona's heart in the original comic, that story didn't really leave him with the emotional resilience to weather even the slightest rough patch in the future, really. By pulling the narrative out of regular Scott's head and showing him mostly through the eyes of the woman coming to love him, the anime gives him more room to be a bit of an idiot like that. But one more of the lovable variety than the self-destructive victim complex type that we see in other versions of this story. Old Scott is that kind of idiot, though, and the distance of time gives regular Scott the needed perspective to actually see that and start, thinking about how not to turn into it. Which is a fantastic alternate motivator for his eventual character growth that still gets him to roughly the same emotional place without needing to give him all that screen time. And on the flip side, watching his younger self drift away from him and low-key invalidate all his self-serving bullshit likewise pushes old Scott's character in a very interesting direction when he eventually returns from 10 years of isolated martial arts meditation as the almighty older Scott, bound and determined to beat up everyone he and Ramona ever knew, because that's gonna make him less sad somehow, maybe? Or possibly she'll come back. He hasn't really thought through any parts of the plan that don't involve violence, honestly. This dark, alternate version of Scott makes a fantastic character foil, not just for his younger self, but for Ramona as the anime's true heroine as well. He reflects back the pitiable fear of rejection that's pushed her to run away from every man and college roommate she's ever loved, and like all of the exes before him, while it does take a very cool fight scene to get there, she and Scott ultimately overcome him and what he represents together by just, talking through their feelings and junk like adults, which isn't something I knew I needed from all these characters until this anime gave it to me. And I love it so much.
This one's just an idiot kid, and this one is a real mess. It's never too late to clean up a mess.
It all just fits so perfectly with what was already there, too. I mean, if you really boil it down, the core conflict of the comic was always between Scott and Ramona and their own stupid, flawed, stubborn selves. And this new approach to externalizing that conflict, compared to Nega Scott in the original, is, I think, much stronger for how it balances both of their responsibility for the problems in both their lives. It also allows the series to explore questions about what it takes not just to start a healthy relationship, but to maintain one for all the years and decades of your life together, which is an aspect of Scott and Ramona's love story that the original couldn't really delve into because they just weren't at that place in their lives yet. It's not often that you can say tacking time travel onto a story enhances its focus on its core themes, but that's exactly what happens here, and it's kind of a miracle. Look, if you love Scott Pilgrim, this is probably going to be your anime of the year. If you've never heard of Scott Pilgrim until this weekend, it honestly still might claim that title. It's that good. Wright, O'Malley, and the team at Science Saru have created something truly special here, and I honestly wish I could just jump back to the late 2000s and tell my teenage self about it just to see the look on my face. I'm Jeff Thu, professional Scott Pilgrim fan, and Oh, wait, shit. I didn't put in anything about young Neil. He's the most important character. Young Neil is so good in this. Anyway, bye.